I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak about Joyce, my favorite subject, as some of you already have indicated is yours, is a great moment for me. I retired from teaching full-time 7 years ago in order to devote myself full-time to writing about Joyce, and I have produced 2 books on Joyce's early stories. This one came out 4 years ago on a whole book study of A Painful Case, one of his lesser stories. Last week, my second book on another full-length book study of a single story came out from the University of Florida Press. I'm a careful reader. It took me 4 years to write this second book, and it's on a 5-page story, which is a sort of microcosm of... The point is that Joyce, from the very beginning of his career, is doing things like Ulysses, even though he's writing tiny little stories. And I'm using sort of Ulysses as a sort of vantage point to understand the enormously expansive imagination that this man has from the beginning. Much underestimated in his early years, and his early works are underestimated. But we know from the later works what kind of mind we have here. So what I'm going to do is introduce you to Ulysses, encourage those who are halfway through or those who are starting to persist. This is, of course, one of the masterworks of Western culture and literature, and it will have to be produced in our language, which makes it accessible by contrast with Dante or Homer or whatever. Now, what I'm going to say, I have arranged here to cover 5 topics of about 10 minutes each. Joyce's biography and the relevance of that to this work. Something about the ideas in Ulysses, and where Ulysses is placed then in Irish culture, literary history, how he's an Irish writer. Then the next question will be, how is he a European? How is he a modernist? How is he an internationalist? How does Ulysses exemplify that? And then Ulysses, its techniques, which is, of course, its great joy, but also its challenge, because it's an original book and a summative book at the same time. So I'll take those topics up, and also in the course of the presentation I will have 2 brief pauses to look at 2 little passages to show like why we're going to all this grand wind-up. You know, what does it look like on the page level? And I'm consider myself a bit of an expert on that because I've mentioned the books I've written on similar little passages that are enormously deeply wrought and profoundly imaginative. First, his biography. He was born in 1882, died in 1941. He was from an Irish middle-class Catholic family, educated by the Jesuits from primary school. He went to school age 6 to Clongowes Wood, eventually ending up at the university in Dublin, where he majored in Italian and French. Again, his teachers were Jesuits. He graduated in 1902 and attempted various careers. He thought about medicine, he thought about singing. He has talents in each of those directions. He thought about journalism, and he tried various things. Also as a writer, he tried writing poetry in the beginning, imitating Yeats. He wrote a play for the Irish theatre, none of which are successful. And then he was asked by Yeats, since he was looking for work and was out of money, recommended by Yeats, and then asked by AE, publisher of a newspaper, I'll give you a guinea if you write me a short story about life as you undersee it around you. And Joyce wrote him 3 little stories, and then the publisher said, no more, please. People don't know what the hell you're writing about. And Joyce, of course, was already in his own world and was able to write for the common reader. At that point, he left Ireland. This was 1900, and he went to Paris first to try medicine and abandoned it after a couple of lectures. Came back to Ireland in 1903 when his mother was dying. And he stayed there for a year. His mother having died, he stayed around until midsummer 1904, at which time he met Nora Barnacle, his future wife, and they eloped together to Europe. And he lived in Trieste at first, then Zurich, and finally also Rome briefly, and ended up his life in Paris during the Second War. He went to Zurich during the First War, wrote most of Ulysses there. by then, this is, I'm skipping on now, 1904, he went off to Europe with a manuscript of Portrait of the Artist in his pocket. He developed that into a full-length novel, revised it. In the meantime, writing these little Dubliner stories while working as an English teacher and also as a banker, none of which he was very good at, nor did he like, but eventually he was recognized for the genius he was by Ezra Pound, who secured money for him through an American benefactor who gave Harriet Weaver, who gave him an annual stipend from about 1916 on for the rest of his life. And Joyce was receiving this stipend every year for at least 20 years before he found out who was giving it to him. And that kept him then as a full-time writer from then on. He lived a bourgeois life once he got established. Of course, his great work is Ulysses. It took him 7 years to write it, and it appeared in 1922 on his 40th birthday, which is the date upon which a man becomes a man, according to the Roman calendar. It was his coming of age. It was, I have now invented myself as a full-scale writer. And the book is about that, as we'll see. Then between 1922 and 1939, he wrote his last book, Finnegan's Wake, which is Ulysses turned inside out. It's the night version of this, and that's his most ambitious work. And he died shortly after finishing. He finished it in 1939 on the verge of the war. Went to Zurich during the war, intending to write another book, a simple book, he said, about the sea. His Paradiso. He's modeled his life on Dante, and he was going to write but he didn't live to do that. What else is important about him? Well, his biography is, I've just mentioned, outlined the thing. Now, he had enormous gifts, and it was recognized from his childhood that he had them, especially musical gifts and linguistic gifts. He had several languages, of course. He learned Latin and French and Italian. He was very fluent in all those languages. We have essays by him in French and Latin from school, poems from his school days. And he also taught himself Dano-Norwegian by himself entirely in order to read Ibsen in the original language. He was an admirer of Ibsen, who was in his last years. We're talking about 1898 to 100. Ibsen died in 1899. Joyce, a freshman at the university, wrote him a letter in Dano-Norwegian saying, "You are at the end of your career. You can die in peace because your torch has been handed on to me." And Ibsen was astonished to discover that this young man would have the temerity to write to him in his own language, a language which, moreover, he taught himself. He could also read and speak German and several dialects, of Italian, and would practice the language by going to bars with sailors and travelers and pick up languages, bits and pieces of languages. Later in his life, when writing Finnegan's Wake, he would stand on the platform of the train station in Zurich and listening to all the passengers coming and going in and out of the trains, picking up words from all the languages he would hear. He was only fluent in 5 or 6, but he knew over 20 slightly. So in Finnegan's Wake, we find word lists from Romanian and Swahili and Icelandic and all that, because he had an enormous energy and ability to collect words. To Joyce, words are as real as Coca-Cola. You know, they're objects as real as the things which they represent. That's important about him. I mean, he's writing about languages as he is as much about things or actions or persons. He had considerable musical ability, as I mentioned, and so his head is full of music, opera especially, light music, music hall stuff, Irish balladry, anything oral. He's not much into orchestral or chamber music or what you hear on Wita. That's not classical music to him. It's opera and song. And if he liked an opera, he would go 5 or 6 nights in a row till he knew the opera backwards and forwards. He could sing any part of it. He knew Dante inside out. He could recite whole cantos. You mentioned it, and he could recite the whole canto from memory. He had an extraordinary memory. He had a total recall of of almost anything he read. Yeats would only have his volumes out, and Joyce could recite the whole volume at parties the next day. You know, he had just extraordinary ability, and of course, reading Ulysses, you recognize the effect of that turned to artistic purposes. His great model is Dante. He studied Dante in college, had a good Italian teacher, and Dante is his model, because Dante writes according to the gold standard at 4 levels all at once: the personal, the historical, the allegorical, and the anagogical. He's writing about experience, representative experience, mythologized experience, and transcendental, its transcendental equivalent. Dante is a Christian. So what's happening in this world has reverberations above. We are emanations of a divine order. That's the fundamental understanding that Dante has of the world, and his work represents that. It's a work of ideas as well as of grace, the world of grace, as it is of the world of action. Okay, and to Joyce, that's the highest standard of creativity. And Joyce, his work is modeled on that. Although he's not a Christian in the same sense as Dante is, of course, but Dante is 600 years before. Joyce is a modern. We'll come to that. Those are some of the general points. Ibsen, Dante, Shakespeare, of course, Homer, although he didn't read Greek. He always regretted that. He tried to learn Greek later in his life and learned to do a bit. We have his notebooks, his grammar books. He attempted as an adult to do so. And he has Greek. He has some, but he couldn't read it. Ulysses. He wrote Dubliners First, it's a collection of short stories about the ways in which one can fail in life. It's a collection of 18 stories that represent the ways in 15 stories, the ways in which you can fail in life. They're portraits of failures. Portrait of the Artist is a portrait of a success, somebody who escapes from the traps of conventional life. That's his autobiographical novel, if you like. It's vastly reformed. It's not autobiographical strictly, and you can't rely on it as autobiography, but of course it's based on his own life, as everything we write would be. So he then turned to this work, which is the relationship between the youth and age, or youth and middle age. Because Stephen is the way Joyce was when he started Ulysses, the way he imagined himself as a young man at the end of Portrait of the Artist, but beginning his life. He's aged 22. And Leopold Bloom is 38. He's a man who's been through life's knocks. He's suffered some setbacks, but he's lived a real life. He's a father, he's a husband, he's a businessman, he's a citizen, he's an odd man out in the city, but he's a whole person. He has suffered. He has triumphed. Leopold Bloom is a man who has faced life's difficulties. And he's not celebrated by anyone. He's not a hero. But he's a hero of Joyce's book because he's like one of us who has survived. So on the first level, it's about maturing. It's about Joyce's contrast of his own early middle age, with his youth. And it's the dialogue, therefore, between his past and his present. He's finishing Ulysses when he's 38, when he's 39, when he's 40. So it's about maturity, about growing up. It's about taking the measure of life. That's one aspect of it. It's the relationship between youth and maturity. It's also the relationship between father and son, of course. All of us, as we grow up, outgrow our parents, we need role models other than them, and we have to find them somewhere. And Stephen is looking for a father figure because his own is an alcoholic, has disappeared out of his life, and his mother has died, so he's having an existential crisis, and he is setting out into life with a lot of potential, and he needs to find a father figure to become a man. Okay, broadly, that's what the book is about, too. It's also about the relationship between mind and body, between Stephen, who's the intellect, without much experience, vastly read, And Bloom, who's a man of experience, a man of not much learning. He's primary school education is all he has, but he's a modern man who's aware of the world. He's a scientific-minded man, like most of us are in this scientific age, and he looks at things objectively, right? He's not religious. He's not Irish. He's not English. He's theoretically Jewish, although he's not Jewish either. But people think he is Jewish, and he thinks he is, but he isn't really. He doesn't meet the requirements for various reasons. But Joyce has created him as a Jew in order to make him a sort of a unique person in Ireland. There are very few Jews in Ireland. There are more now than there were then, but they weren't recognizable citizens. They weren't typical at all. And Joyce only knew one or two very slightly, and they were a bit like Bloom. So Joyce picks a man who has sort of made it on his own, who can't be typecast as an Irishman. He's not Paddy O'Brien, not somebody you can say, oh, he's Irish. So Joyce doesn't allow the Irish to claim him. Doesn't allow the Jews to claim him either, although they do. They have no reason to claim him. The Irish do, because Bloom is an international figure. He's a man he can't typecast him as one of a particular tribe. That's an important point, of course. He's unique in all kinds of ways, although typical in all kinds of other ways. Another way in which I should finish that point. Bloom represents the intelligent, sensual man, the man who's rational, practical, generous, thoughtful, wrong about almost everything. I mean, all his ideas are slightly off or wrong, but he's right in the main. I mean, he's got generally the right idea, but he's got all the facts wrong. Or not all the facts, but every time he theorizes about anything, all the scientific information he has is all slightly garbled, as you know. If you know whatever he talks about, you'll find he's a very inquiring mind, but he's only half educated, so he's got all the theories slightly off, which is the way most of us are about most things. You just have to read the letters to the post or whatever, and you recognize that most people haven't a bloody idea about what anything is about. They just know vaguely what it's about, right? Democracy. No, hardly anybody could define it for you, but they believe in it, for example. And Joyce knew that perfectly well, and Joyce was quite amused at the fact that most people subscribed to things they didn't really understand. So Bloom is a good person, and he's a good person without being a religious person, which is also a point that Joyce wants to make. Bloom therefore represents sort of the unformed mind, but primarily he's a sensuous person. He's aware of the world through his feelings. He's a man of objective reality. He isn't overburdened with theories. They don't burden him in the way in which Stephen's mind is burdened with theories. So Stephen has to break out of that idealization of life in order to come to terms with it. And Bloom is theoretically the answer, right? So they represent sort of sensuousness and intellect. Molly Bloom, on the third hand, represents the body, the fleshly world, the real one, the one that bears children, Bloom's daughter. She's the unseen presence in the book. We don't see her till the end, but she's on everybody's mind. So we have youth, maturity, father, son, mind, body, sensuality. Another major idea in it, of course, is Joyce is writing a democratic book. He's writing a book that's celebrating any one of us. Joyce is very suspicious, taught by Nietzsche, of whom he admired, not to admire the heroes, that history is made up of the millions of stories of unknown people, like Leopold Bloom. And their virtues are ones that are relevant to us, not the virtues of Jesus or Moses. You know, these are so above the rest of us that we can just gaze at them in awe. But Bloom is somebody who's like us, or we could be like him. And he survives in a generous way. And he's admirable because of the richness of his personality. When you finish this book, you'll know Bloom probably better than you know yourself. He's the most realized character in all of literature. And Joyce, of course, had that very much in mind when he set about writing this character, who is not like him at all. Joyce's self-portrait would be Stephen, but he imagined Bloom out of whole cloth. He's anti-heroic, and he's therefore celebrating also democratic values. Bloom has the values that we recognize in the average responsible citizen. He's also an urban citizen. That's an important point about him as well. He appeals to us because we're urbanites. We live in an industrial, urban, secular, scientific-minded culture, and Bloom is like us. Bloom also lives by selling ads, which is again something we know all about because we're bombarded with them every minute of the day if we turn on the media. We're in a world of advertising, and Bloom is already, Joyce saw this coming and makes Bloom an advertising salesman because impressions and marketing are the devices by which capitalism functions. Another major theme of the book is the relationship between religious belief and unbelief. Bloom is a non-practicing Jew. He's a secular Jew. He has some Jewish memories, of course, and he dreams of buying land in Palestine. The beginning of the Zionist movement, as you know, had just occurred in the 1890s, and there was enthusiasm for purchasing land. Bloom dreams of that, although not realistically, but it's part of his dream of a fulfilled life. It's not going to happen, but he thinks that way. He identifies himself, and other people call him Jewish, but he's not burdened by any crisis of faith. In the Circe episode, his grandfather does accuse him of having abandoned Judaism, but it's not an issue for Bloom personally. Whereas for Stephen, the crisis of faith is real. His mother has just died, and whether she's praying for him as she says she will in the next life is something that Stephen can't get rid of, the idea that her ghost is following him. And in the course of the novel, he does confront that existential crisis he has, which is the relationship between the Christian faith that he inherited from her, like Joyce himself, and his own skepticism about it, because he's a modern intellectual who finds the claims of Christianity to be rather of doubtful credibility. However laudable the ideas may be, they're not sound, he thinks. And therefore, he's trying to break clear of the guilt that's laid upon him by that abandoned faith. And so that's an issue in the novel, of course, at several different levels. As you would appreciate, the novel, presence of Dante in the novel, the presence of Dante in Joyce's life presents him with a similar relationship between his own modernity and his model, who is the great Christian poet. Another important issue in the novel is, of course, the fact that we all live in a real place. We live in Takoma Park or Springfield, and that's as real a place as any place else, as Athens or Rome or Paris or New York. You may read The New Yorker, but you're not any less credible as a person. You don't have anything less authentic in life with the fact that you don't live there. Although you might envy people who live there. But you have an authentic life. Be confident, right, in your own experience. Dublin is just fine, thank you very much, right? And so that's a center. Joyce wants to make it the center of the world, displacing London and Rome, the two Irish capitals, right? The old joke that Ireland is the only country in the world with two capitals, neither is in it, Rome and London, right? Joyce is doing his version of freeing Ireland from the imperia of Rome and of London. But seriously, though, all knowledge begins, as Aristotle says, through experience. We get it through the experience of our lives, through our failures and our hungers and our sins and our triumphs and so on, and our objective experience. That's how we learn. And we put this together. That's the Aristotelian notion, as in contrast with Plato, who proposes the opposite, that we begin with innate ideas and then fill in the blanks through experience. That's a fundamental issue in the novel, by the way, the tension between Platonic idealism and Aristotelian realism. That's a constant tension in the structure of the novel and in its devices. That is, Joyce sets it in Dublin on June 16, 1904, the day he met Nora Barnacle, the day she, well, not the day he met her, the day she said yes to him, because that changed his life. That yes that she said to him made him confident that he could be loved. His mother having died, he was loveless in the world, and he needed a replacement for it. And he had consorted with prostitutes and had various other women friends, but none of them was satisfactory in any real sense until Nora showed up. And she said yes to him, that she would go with him and be his wife. This book is his wedding ring to her. They had no wedding ceremony, they didn't get married. But this book, he gave the first copy, signed it and handed it to her. This is our wedding, he said to her. She sold it. And so he, because she had to feed the children, he wasn't concerned about that. Joyce would put his own artistic needs before his family's, I must say. He was not particularly generous about that. He would go to the opera and the children would be hungry because it was important for him to see it. And he had a piano always. He always rented one or had one, even though they were hungry, because he had to have music. You know? He wasn't a soft-hearted, generous person in any way in which he was very selfish and very extremely self-confident, and used other people, no question about it. But he says they'll all be grateful for having done so, and they are. He had real confidence in his own genius, and he had good reason to do so. And he was Nietzschean enough not to be soft-hearted or to be I feel pity for anybody who might have felt aggrieved by his abuse. He's writing then about real time and real place, so that the action in Ulysses is absolutely true to the events of the day. Joyce has got the newspapers and the maps and the records of the day. He had the property records for the city, so he knew who lived at every property in the city, and he knew the length of every street, and he knew what was printed on the cellar flap on the sidewalks, and where the signboards were. Everything like that he has, and if he doesn't remember it, he checks it out. He has somebody. He didn't live in Dublin when he wrote this book. Of course, he was at a distance from it, so he had to reconstruct it from memory and with the help of innumerable aids. This is a reprint of the original 1922. It looked like this with the Greek blue cover on it when it came out. But it's celebrating Dublin as a centre of a new myth, the myth of Ireland. And this is the Irish epic, the corresponding one to Virgil for Rome or Homer for Greece. Seriously, that's what he's doing. He's writing a national epic, but in modern terms. Right? He's attempting to write something on an epic level. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes again. So I was pointing out that it's real, that it's this is an important point about it. It certainly occurred to me recently. When Joyce was a young man, his crisis of faith was produced not by his encounter with prostitutes, which is what you might think from portrait. That's one way in which it's not autobiographical, in my view. It's when he discovered that the Gospels weren't reliable, that they didn't all agree with one another. He came across a collated edition of the Gospels and found that they had serious disagreements. Then he realized that, well, they're only approximate on the historical level. Then you can't believe them on the basis of their historicity. Of course, we know that now. We're long past that shock that he encountered then. But by damn it, when he was writing his book, it was going to be better than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He was going to get the facts right. You know, they don't agree on how Jesus was born. They don't all agree on the number of people who were fed at a certain point, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of, right? We can get by that. I have anyway. But he said, no, I'm going to do the thing from the bottom. Everything's going to be reliable from the bottom up, from the ground level up to the superstructure. So you can cross-check it. People have found some mistakes, but there are very, very few. They're based on his sources, not on himself. Another point I've mentioned then 5 or 6 major ideas in it. Another one is this is something that you probably already know about because he publicized it himself. It distorted the point a little. That it's parallel to the Odyssey, right? It's called Ulysses. So each chapter, each of the 18 chapters corresponds to a chapter in the Odyssey. And a lot of details then are mimicked out of Homer's epic. Yes, that's true. Joyce, and he calls it Ulysses, and he wanted to have it printed, as I said, with the blue Greek cover on it. Each of the chapters does have correspondences with the Homeric episodes, and he selected them to fit his schema. The general point being that this is a modern hero. And in general, this is an epic, an Irish epic, modeled on the great model for all Western culture, the Odyssey. And Odysseus is the all-round man. He's a husband and leader and military man and lover and survivor from the wiles of various women who try to trap him and so on. He's an all-round man. And Bloom is an all-round man too, but not a man of violence. Of course, there's a major difference. Bloom is a pacifist. Bloom is a man who believes that you should, that violence is not the manly virtue that heroic literature makes it out to be. An issue that my students always asked about is, why didn't Bloom go home and punch out Blazes Boylan? That's what Jerry Springer would advise him to do, or you know. But Bloom doesn't do that. Bloom is going to work it out with her, and he's resilient, and he recognizes that he's partially responsible for the problem, that it's partly his responsibility that Molly is is unfaithful. So his solution to problems are pacific and civilized and humane. Bloom is a humane person. He loves cats and animals, feeds the gulls, and he's kind and thoughtful. He's helping to raise money to help out the widow, Dignam's widow, and so on. He does charitable works, gets no credit for it, au contraire, yet he does it out of friendship to another citizen. He's a responsible man without expecting any eternal reward for it, because he doesn't believe in the afterlife or anything like that. He does it because he's a good human being. So Joyce there is a moral in it in that sense, but it's not an obviously moralistic book. Now, maybe I should take a passage just to relieve the monotone here. I look at one of the passages that I've chosen. This is the first one. The grainy sand had gone from under his feet. Let me just play it from the RTE recording. I have it set up here. This is the ensemble one that was done. So
is this the Proteus section?
As the Proteus,
okay,
yes.
Okay, so in the Scabler edition, Gabler edition, it's page 34, and in the Modern Library or Vintage edition, it should be around 4041.
It's 4041, right. I hope this is correct now. Play.
One feels that one is at one with one who once.
The grainy sand had gone from under his feet. His boots trod again a damp, crackling mass, razor shells, squeaking pebbles.
That on the unnumbered pebbles beats.
Wood sinked by the shipworm.
Lost armada.
Unwholesome sandflats waited to suck his treading soles, breathing upwards sewage breath. He coasted then, walking warily. A porter bottle stood up, stobbed to its waist in the cakey sand dough.
A sentinel, isle of dreadful thirst.
Broken hoops on the shore. At the land, a maze of dark, cunning nets. Farther away, chalk-scrawled back doors, and on the higher beach, a drying line with 2 crucified shirts.
Rings End. Wigwams of ground steersmen and master mariners. Human shells.
He halted.
Okay. I was 12 years of age when I encountered this passage. I'd been reading Agatha Christie and Enid Blyton and Robert Louis Stevenson. When I read this, like yourself, my life changed. Because I realized this is a 600-page book written like this. You know, suddenly I realized that the world is much larger, world of literature is much larger than I'd ever imagined. I'll just look at this little passage just briefly with you. Stephen is walking along the beach, and he's very depressed for reasons we know, and he's thinking about how life's forms are continuously shifting and changing, and nothing is fixed at all. And can you be certain of anything in this world is the inference from it. And he's meditating on that as he walks along the beach. I'll just gloss this passage very quickly. You see that the sand is metonymized here. The sand had gone. He doesn't say he walked along the sand, as if the sand itself were moving, right? Stephen is also detached from his feet. He's looking at his feet. So his feet are like disembodied other parts of himself, which isn't himself, but something else. This is an inference of the feet at the end of the sentence. His boots trod again the damp again, as if the boots were themselves metonymized or personified, or at least animated, a damp crackling mass. This is a piece of flotsam. These are the razor shells, squeaking pebbles that are on the unnumbered pebbles beats. Now, you noticed in the reading that the voice changed there, because the narrator, the concealed narrator, is the one who's narrating the passage. And we're getting interruptions from Stephen's voice, which we get that on the unnumbered pebbles beats. This is Stephen thinking about what the narrator is telling us he's doing. Now, that's a quotation from King Lear. Stephen's head is full of literary quotations and texts, and they're always intervening between him and his real experience, which is one of the things that makes him an idealist or an intellectual. The grammar of the thing, of course, already suggests that it's an interruption. And when you look at the speech in King Lear from which this comes, you'll recognize that Lear is in a similar situation, thinking about the beach over which he's looking in the crisis at the climax of that play. Anytime Joyce is supremely responsible. There's absolutely nothing in Joyce is throwaway. There's no accidents. This is not a chaotic book. Everything is managed. This is managed in the way in which God managed this world. Everything has already been considered by the Creator, and Joyce is responsible in that way. So everything has an explanation, everything. And if it isn't obvious, then you've got to think again. Wood sieved by the shipworm, lost Armada. That's Stephen, of course, thinking about the spar that's on the beach, and it's been eaten by the shipworm, by the woodworm. And marvelous line. That thrilled me the minute I heard it when I was a child. Wood sieved by the shipworm, because it works two ways, of course. Because the little worm ate it and passed it through its body and turned it into sawdust. But by drilling it, turned it into a sieve too. So the word sieve works two ways, right? Wood sieved by the shipworm, and they repeated S's and I's there. It almost gives you the sound of the teeth of the little worm eating the wood. You know? That's the kind of guy we got here. And of course, lost Armada. Well, the Spanish Armada was wrecked on the Irish coast in 1588, and it could have liberated Ireland, but it didn't. It was a failure, a disappointment to us. which is, of course, part of the deflationary theme of the passage here. Unwholesome sand flats wetted to suck treading soles, breathing upward sewage breath. This is the, again, personified Protean beach. Suck. You see, you notice the relationship, the metaphors here of drinking and eating. Halitosis. Proteus has bad breath. At that time, there was no central sewage system in Ireland. Just the raw sewage went into the ocean and was washed up on these beaches. And it was just at the time Ulysses is being written, the action is occurring, they are actually putting in the sewage system, which we still have in Dublin. But at that time, sewage breath was everywhere. And it's a function, it's a feature of Joyce's objectivity. Joyce is not somebody who euphemizes anything. Ulysses is the first book in which a character takes a shit, and we watch him do it. And that has never occurred before. But we do it all the time, but we don't talk about it. And it wasn't a fit subject for literature. And when Joyce sent this book to his aunt, who was a very sweet person, she said, this book isn't fit to read. And Joyce said, well, if that's so, life isn't fit to be led. And of course, he's right. He writes about life as he sees it, with all its problems and embarrassments and joys. A pocket of seaweeds, I better skip on. He coasted them, I'll watch the time here. He coasted them walking warily. Note the rhythm of that. The rhythm of those lines echoes the rhythm of the walking, the double dactyl. A porter bottle stood up to its stog to its waist in the cakey sand dough. Again, the rhythm of that sentence slows down as its sense does, because we're talking about something getting stuck in the sand. The word stogged, of course, is a Joycean neologism. He creates these words all the time. Parenthetically, I should note that Ulysses has something like 90,000 different words in it. The average novel has no more than that entirely in it. So it's a language challenge to read it. Stogged is an original word. Like Shakespeare, he makes them up. But you can, you don't need to be a lexicographer to see what that stogged is, a combination of stock and bog, perhaps. Stogged. And of course, we understand immediately what he's saying. A bottle stuck in the sand. Notice the relationship between drink and food there. Bottle and cakey, right? Right. A sentinel, isle of dreadful thirst, as if it were a lighthouse, or somebody watching the ocean. Isle of dreadful thirst is, of course, Ireland. Alcoholism, bottle, all right. But Isle of dreadful thirst is a quotation from the Bible, from the Isaiah, I think, the Valley of Dry Bones. He's picking, again, that's Stephen, of course, thinking there. Broken hoops of the shore, the land a maze of dark, cunning nets. He's passing by a fishing village, and he sees the broken barrel hoops. They made barrels out of wood then, and with hoops to hold them together. The broken hoops, the broken circles, a symbol of alcohol again, but also of the broken circle. I mean, the image of imperfection and emptiness. A maze of dark cunning nets. It's a great Joycean line that the nets are made by the fishermen to trap the fish, like socialization is set up to trap us, to being good citizens and being obedient children, etc. Farther away, chalk scrawled back doors, and on the higher beach, a drying line with two crucified shirts. He's looking at the backs of the houses. The fronts are turned towards the street, and he's looking at the ugly side of life. Drying line with two crucified shirts. Notice the two crucified. The third one is missing. Jesus isn't there. We have the two thieves. We have, like the broken hoop, you have suffering and sin without redemption. I presume that. But the two crucified are a brilliant image, of course, because that's the way the shirts were hung out to dry. And the crucified is a wonderful image. It picks up other images back through the passage. The relationship then between crucifixion and and the Last Supper, if you like, or redemption, or failure of it is an under theme of the passage. Rings End, wigwams of brown steersmen and master mariners. This is Stephen, of course, thinking. Rings End is the name of the village. Actually, it is, but it fits with the broken hoops image, because a Rings End and a broken hoop fit. Joyce is wonderful at finding ways in which geographical and linguistic plays can work with one another to give a complex metaplasmic effect. He's absolutely a master of that kind of thing. And he's looking then, of course, at the boats, the fishing boats tied up, wigwams. That's the image of the wrapped sails wrapped around the masts as they're when they're at anchor or pulled up on the shore. But we think of the Indians crossing the plains in pursuit of the buffalo, like the sailors, fishermen crossing the oceans after the fish. Elaborate parallel of displaced people, like the Irish, displaced from their land, all immigrants, and so on and so on and so on. So Joyce is able to immediately to create a complex set of analogies between the Irish, the Indians, and the fishermen. Human shells, the empty of aspirations, but the flotsam and emptied lives emptied of spiritual energy. You can see where Eliot's Wasteland is coming from when you read this, because this came first.
And this has to do with this passage that you first read when you did and it just knocked you out. But you couldn't unpack this.
Oh,
here.
no.
No, but it was, I think of this in relation to our reading and discussing this book, because we're not going to be discussing each passage in each chapter over the next the many times we meet. So I don't know if it's possible to say what was it? It's just that feeling that there was just such a richness here, and then as time went on, you sort of it takes study, and so I think what I'm maybe getting at is that we're going to have to be content with 10th knowledge, quarter knowledge, and over the next number of weeks is to choose passages, and this is where it's going to depend on all of us, and maybe using our thread. Yes. That we can then look at them. We have a guide, we'll have a sense of how the chapters are moving, and in a sense, I think over our discussion is that we're going to be learning how to read this book and not be afraid of it, in a sense, because there's so many different narrative structures and so many different things going on.
Right.
I didn't mean to throw
Exactly. You could read it on different levels. Obviously, as a child, I didn't, but the poetry is thrilling. I mean, Wood Sif by the Shipworm, Lost Our Mad, was just thrilling. Nobody writes like that. But this is a real poet writing. You don't have to necessarily understand it, but even if you have feeling for language, you immediately are thrilled, because this is original. This is nothing derivative about this. Where it is derivative, it's derivative in a very sophisticated way. He's already, like the unnumbered pebbles beats, he's pulled something out of Shakespeare. And if you go back to Shakespeare, you see that it's not just pulled out because it sounds nice. It actually fits this parallel scene with one we have here. And similarly with citation from Isaiah, it fits here too. He has there's nothing cheap about him. There's absolutely nothing at all. It's all highly responsible and highly intelligent and always pointed. And somebody said to him once, "Mr. Joyce, some of your lines are so trivial, the connections you're making." He says, "Yes, some are trivial and more are quadrivial." He had everything. He had a wonderful sense of humor, of course. That's one of the great things about him. He's not pompous at all. Now, I'll move on to talk about the modernity of this. And then we look at another passage, an easier one, a Bloom passage for contrast. Okay, this is of course the locus classicus of modernism. Modernism in literature is the movement between 1900 and 1940 in the arts, in all the arts, music, painting, literature. And Joyce's Ulysses is the benchmark here. Modernism has passed. We're into postmodernism now. And some writers who have never heard of either. They're still writing as if Dickens was the last word. most popular writers are like that, because it's a univocal world. Everything is just the way it looks. You can write bestsellers that way, but you can't write anything serious that way. Joyce changes the game, and these are the ways in which he does. One, he's skeptical about traditional religious and aesthetic inheritances. So he's creating a work based upon mythic structures, on multiple mythic structures, not just the Homeric one, but also the biblical one. The book is also structured on the relationship between the New and Old Testaments, because Bloom is to Moses as Jesus, as Stephen is to Jesus. And it's about the relationship between father and son, between Jews and Christians at another level. I mean, it's an allegory of the relationship between Old and New Testaments, and therefore of the other main pillar of Western civilization, the biblical one, the Greek one being the rational one. He takes both very seriously, and they're both represented in very serious, substantial ways here. Therefore, his pointing out to us that it has Homeric parallels is just not meant to be a definitive answer to the structural question I'm mentioning here, but to be an incentive to search for others. Because there are many in it. There are multiple structures going on parallel to one another in the book, not just the Greek and biblical. The book is highly ironic. It's very funny, and there's nothing is pompous or preachy in it. He's not telling us how to live. You can learn to live from it, but he's not telling you that. You have to figure it out for yourself, like you do in life itself. The book is very much like life in that it doesn't give you answers. There's no Sermon on the Mount. There's no Declaration of Independence. There's no statement of human rights in it. You have to make judgments all the time. This is very important in the book. The book is highly complex in its devices. It's dialogic. That is, there's always several voices going on, sometimes several all at once. The little passage we just read has two voices, the narrators and Stephen's, for example. And Stephen takes himself very seriously, and the narrator is not necessarily a definitive voice either, because the narrator is sometimes lapses. I'll come back to that narrative question in a few minutes. But the narrative voice, which shifts from chapter to chapter, by the way, is an issue. And also, in many chapters, there are two voices, or three or four, all competing with one another. And it's very difficult to know, which of them to take seriously, or which of them the book takes seriously. The answer is that the book as a whole has meaning, has coherence, has order, like the universe, we believe. But you have a lot of ways to interpret that. You can interpret it creationist way, or an evolutionary way, or some other way. You don't have to take it any particular way, and there's evidence supporting all of these. That's true in Ulysses also. Ulysses is supremely smart that way, and is ironic and detached in its presentation of a vast complexity of material that we have to make sense of ourselves. Now, we make sense of life in ordinary ways by judgment. We judge people, we judge the weather, we judge the stock market, we judge whether our car will get us there or not. We're making judgments all the time. And those are practical judgments based on experience. Now, in Ulysses, the experience that will enable you to read this book is none of those. It's literary experience. You have to have literary taste to make sense of it, because the moral judgments that you make depend upon your ability to make literary judgments about what's in bad taste and what's in good taste, and how it works. You have to yourself, if you haven't read Shakespeare, you can't, for example, make sense of that particular citation. It'll mean nothing to you. Well, the more you know, the better you're able to judge. You still can get pleasure out of it without necessarily understanding it, but the more you know, the more you've read, the better your literary taste, the more you can make sense out of this. Okay? Therefore, one of the inferences that I make from that is that it's also vastly easy to misread. And critics disagree. There's whole shelves of books on it. I've added to a couple of them, because I have my own view of it. Of how you judge these things, and I realize it comes out of a whole lot of complexity of historical, cultural, linguistic, and cultural presumptions. But Joyce is coming out of some too, but he's trying to transcend them by giving us a universal book. It's highly complex, therefore. It's ambiguous, always. You never know what exactly happens or what exactly, how this problem is resolved. There's nothing resolved easily, like there might be on a Jerry Springer show where there's a punch out and one loses, the other wins. It's not like that. It has to be done through threading your way through the ambiguities. It's, of course, by the same token, elitist and learned. You know, if you haven't read anything, you can't read it. It's why one of the reasons I gave up teaching it to undergraduates at George Mason about 15 years ago, because the students just couldn't do it. They didn't have enough. They got so intimidated by it that they stopped after 5 or 6 chapters. They didn't know enough. They didn't know who John the Baptist was. They didn't know who Moses was. They didn't know who Pascal was. Never heard of him. Well, if they don't have that, then they can't read it. Or they're going to have to do an awful lot of quick reading fast, and they weren't willing to do it. You know, it's part of the decline of civilization, as I understand it. This book depends upon civilized traditions, and if you haven't inherited them, if something has come between you and those, which unfortunately it has through electronic culture, although it should be the opposite, students just aren't willing to make the effort that this book requires. But that's true of anything serious. And I don't know where the future is, but this book is the book of the 20th century. Whether it will be in the 21st or not is a matter that most of us around here won't have to worry about. Sorry, but I feel very fatalistic about it, I'm afraid. It's an internationalist book. It is produced during the Irish cultural literary revival, when Ireland is trying to break out of the British Empire, and it did. It did in the 2 weeks before this book was published. The Irish delegation signed the treaty with Britain, liberating us from those unspeakable people, those English. This book is Joyce's contribution to Irish freedom. He seriously means that. He's liberating us not from British imperialism, but from ignorance and from complacency. He wants to raise the literary standards in the world as a whole, while everybody else is involved in getting the Brits out. And he's not going to do it. He's not going to get involved in that. Although Bloom is obviously interested in it, but he's not a rabid nationalist, as we know. He wants human freedom, not new flags. He's not a hater of the being English, but Joyce isn't either. But he recognizes the problem. This is an international book. He wants to make Ireland European. That's his object. Not just to get free of the British, but to become world citizens, which is, of course, what's happened. Ireland has become part of the European Union, and Britain is no longer the issue. So this book is now being appreciated in Ireland in a way in which one would never have thought 50, 60 years ago, when the conflict with Britain was more in people's minds. It's a book of it's an internationalist book in the obvious sense that it's citing literature from all over the world. I mean, it's a book of universal significance. Joyce is not waving any nationalist flag here. One of the things that's important to know about Joyce is that he's very, very guarded and opposed to any mass movement, whether it's Catholicism or Irish nationalism or any ism at all, Marxism or feminism. He will have nothing to do with any one of these movements. They all try to claim him, but he doesn't really, he will not pull ideological baggage for anybody. He's his own man. So he's very critical and skeptical about the claims of imperium, of course, the claims of nationalism, the claims of Catholicism, the claims of Judaism, whatever they are, he's skeptical about them. They dragoon people into following some ritual or some simplified version of the truth, which is only representable in this. This is a serious challenge, in other words, to the Bible. And he's writing a book which is as complex as the Bible and as significant. He seriously has that in mind, to write a book which will challenge the Holy Book. Okay? And he's serious enough to... Now, of course, the book at the same time has no plot interest, or hardly any. What you normally expect in a novel or a story, you're not getting. So you could summarize the plot in one paragraph, right? There's not much there. And in fact, that plot we have doesn't resolve it. I won't spoil it for anybody, but you don't get a clear answer. Do Bloom and Stephen become friends for forever after? Do Molly and Bloom resume sex? What's going to happen with Millie? There's a lot of unknowns in the thing. Like our own lives. We have a lot of unresolved issues today. We won't resolve them necessarily today. And when we have crises in life, we don't resolve them and quickly change. Some things go on forever, and they just barely get resolved before death, if then. We don't change. We don't convert overnight. Nobody does. Anybody who says they do is probably codding you, or themselves. Joyce is very skeptical about conversion stories and about changes of heart and all that sort of thing. So, and this book is about the slow processes of daily life. And the issue is how we barely begin to chip away at the problems we have. We make some progress and slip back in others and so on. And it's about that. And of course, it's universal in that sense. Now, technically, this is the great, Joyce's great innovation, of course. Joyce is first vastly read. Joyce's experience in life is very narrow, much narrower than mine, which isn't great. But he hasn't traveled half as much as I have, for example, or you, I'm sure. He did very little. He never, like Hemingway, hunted lions. He didn't like to be reminded of that, by the way. Hemingway boasted about it. He was a friend of Hemingway's and admired Hemingway. But he didn't do anything like that. He never went to sports meets or he never bet on anything. He didn't play cards and he didn't... he went to bars, yeah. But he spent his time reading. He's vastly read. They made a movie of his... called Nora a few years ago with his wife, and it's an hour and a half long. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful film about her life. It shows him all the way through it, but he's only seen looking at a book for about 25 seconds. What a bullshit movie. This guy spent his life reading and writing, and we only get 25 seconds in an hour and a half. The person having a notion of what we're dealing with a writer. We're not dealing with a man of the streets. We're not dealing with a sportsman. We're dealing with a man of ideas. Joyce is hugely read, and I've made it my business in writing these books I have about the early stories to have read everything that Joyce had read at the time he wrote them, which is a fair lot of reading. But I'm 70 years of age, but he wrote these when he was 20. So it's not much of a boast, but I did make sure to have read everything, including the newspapers. And then I can see what he's doing, because, and it is a lifetime work to do that, and it has taken a lifetime. Now, technically, Joyce is a master. He's read everything that matters. All the literature that he has his hands on in many languages, he's read them. So he's very sophisticated technically. And you can get a great deal of satisfaction out of appreciating what those technical skills are. I'll mention them quickly, and then we'll look at a passage. One, of course, the most obvious thing is stream of consciousness, right? You're seeing the way a mind works. The way your own mind works, the way most of your life is lived privately. What you're thinking, what you're dreaming, what you're thinking as you're speaking to somebody. You're saying one thing, but you're thinking something else. What a bastard. While you're being very nice. Bloom is doing that. And we see that all the time. Joyce gives a delicious sense of the difference between the way we appear and the way we are, or whatever. Stream of consciousness. Also, interior monologue. That is, when a person is talking to themselves. Bloom, particularly, is a rich interior monologue. A very funny person. You know, after a while, how he's going to think. Full of new ideas, full of fresh observations and all that. A very important aspect of Joyce's technique is his use of what we call free indirect discourse. I will pick that up in a minute. We'll look at a passage and I'll show you an example. Free indirect discourse is the voice of the narrator, which without telling you is quoting the character that they're writing about without making it obvious, so that you have slipped into the mind of the character without knowing it and back out again. Joyce is a master of this very subtle narrative technique. He does it from Dubliners on, but he's doing it here at a very high level. He's also writing like Dante. Everything he writes operates on several levels all at once. The literal, historical, anagogical, etc. So, for example, the book is called Ulysses, but he also calls it a useless book. I mean, he's capable of bad puns like that. It's a work of art. It has no value. It has no practical value. It might be a doorstop, but it has no value in any kind of practical way. It's a useless book. It's a book of self-justifying. Right? His book observes the classical unities, time and place. It all occurs within 24 hours in the same place, with the same small cast of characters, and all the action arises out of the characters established. He's a strict classical disciplinarian that way. It's highly intertextual. It's citing hundreds of books that he's read. So intertextuality is what we mean by that. He's quoting everybody else. So it's a book of quotations, as somebody said about it. It's sure enough. It's almost every word in it is a quotation of something else. But that's what civilization is. We're recycling previous experiences, previous observations. We elected a pope today, and there was a lot of other ones before him. It's a repeating ourselves. That'll come up in a minute. A Jesuit this time, not called Francis. What do you think about that? It's also metaleptic. It's full of metaphors and double metaphors, like pyramids. You'll find one reference here and one reference here, and then they have references within themselves to refer to other references. Sometimes goes up to 3 levels. It's called metalepsis, a double metaphor. He's a master of that kind of thing too. I won't have time to illustrate that here, but I'll maybe come back to it if we have time. Another feature of his work is what's called the arranger. I should point this. I should back off for a second on this. There's 18 chapters in the novel, 3, 12, and 3. First 3, last 3, and then 12 in the middle. And so it's balanced that way. And the middle chapter is also itself a microcosm of the book as a whole. It's highly chiastic. Chiasmus is Joyce's favorite rhetorical trope. In other words, everything is balanced, like a Greek temple. You know, he loves sentences which begin and end on the same word with an axial one in the middle, like the peak on the roof. That's a classical sense of balance and order. He has that all through his work, in everything he does. In Portrait of the Artist, for example, it's about nation, family, and church. And if you go to the middle page of that book, although it doesn't look like it, the words family, nation, and church occur in the middle of the Hellfire sermon, for example. But he does this all over the place. And you'll find that in Ulysses, for example, the first chapter and the 18th chapter match in certain ways. The second and the 17th, the third and the 16th, and so on, all the way to the middle. And the middle then is itself made up of 19 parts, all of which correspond to one another into the middle of that. You know, it's like a tree, all the rings on the tree. You know, it's highly disciplined in ways that aren't apparent to the reader going right through from beginning to end. It's not just a straight narrative. It's built by a master tactician of design. It's profoundly designed, you know, like nature itself. There are deep orders in it we don't see. We're only learning them. He's seriously making an effort to imitate the divine creator of the world. Pride is his sin. If he's not in heaven, it's on that account, not on account of having wasted his talents. The book, for those who are beginning, the first 3 chapters are some of the toughest. Chapter 4 on, it's much easier. We're going to look at a little section now from, we have to move on it, from Bloom. The thing eases up a little. But then when you get to the last few chapters, it gets really tough when he gets into full stride. And by the time he's done, he has produced what we call an encyclopedia of literary procedures. Every way in which you can describe anything, he's done it in this book. All the ways in which people have done it before, he's already done it here and done it better. He's summarizing all the ways in which you can describe anything. So the novel is finished. Once he's finished with this, you can't write novels anymore without going back to first grade, because you already graduated, right? So when you read your Joyce, if you're a serious writer, you have choices to make. You can ignore them, which a lot of people do, or try to improve on them. Some have attempted, and some have moderately succeeded in some ways. But you can't ignore them, and you're naive if you think you can be a writer without having read Joyce. You're just living in another age or something. So he will either move you if you've got the talent, or discourage you if you haven't. Let me just look at another little passage, because I've said almost everything I wanted to. I wanted to look at a little passage because it's so beautiful, and it illustrates something of the spirit of Bloom. This is Lestrygonians. This is the eating chapter. Bloom is walking by along the Liffey, and he sees the seagulls play.
You grab a turkey, say, on chestnut meat, it tastes like that. Eat pig, like pig. But then why is it that saltwater fish are not salted? How is that?
His eyes sought answer from the river, and saw a rowboat rock at anchor and the treacly swells lazily its plastered board.
Kilos, 11 shillings trousers. Good idea, that. Wonder if he pays rent to the corporation. How can you own water, really? It's always flowing in a stream, never the same. Which in the stream of life we tread, because life is a stream. All kind of places are good for ants. That quack doctor for the clap used to be stuck up in all the greenhouses. Never see it now. Strictly confidential, Dr. High Frax. Didn't cost him a rent, like McGinney, the dancing master, self-advertisement. Got fellows to stick them up, or stick them up himself for that matter on the QT, running in to loosen a button, fly by night. Just the place to post no bills, post 110 pills. Some chap with a dose burning him.
You're introduced here to Bloom's wonderful, resilient, humorous interior monologue. And we see him feeding the gulls. And again, notice his humane feelings. He bought a penny cake and is feeding the gulls. And he's concerned with, as a responsible citizen, with possible epidemics. They spread foot and mouth. When you read Ulysses, you recognize Stephen has a lot of issues on his mind. And then when we meet Bloom, Bloom has a lot of different issues on his mind. He's a different personality, yet in all kinds of important ways, they're thinking about the same things, but in quite different ways. For example, in this case, foot and mouth disease, he's thinking about there was an epidemic of foot and mouth disease in the animals in Ireland and in Britain, and there was concern at the time for their culture, and it's in the news. So he's thinking about it. He's wondering if the seagulls bring it, which is not likely, but he's worried all the same. But Stephen earlier in the novel has offered to bring a letter for Mr. Deasy to the newspaper about foot and mouth disease. So they have, it's on each of their minds. Like that's what it means to be citizens. We all have the same things to talk about: the elections or the sequestering or whatever. And he wonders about if you cram turkey, say, or chestnut meat, it tastes like that. Eat pig like pig. You recognize that that's it's a fact of cooking. You can you season something and it tastes a bit like the seasoning. Are pigs just pigs, or are they parts of other things? I mean, Stephen has been thinking about that earlier with Proteus, right? How things blend into one another. Pigs aren't discrete animals. They're part of the universe, and we're part of them. And then he says, why is it that saltwater fish are not salty? Now there's a scientific question, right? And there is a scientific answer to that question that you can look up, and Joyce had. But so he has Bloom asking it here. How is that? His eyes sought answer. Now he's a scientist, but he's also an advertiser. And his eyes sought answer from the river. Notice that it's his eyes that do it. Bloom is not really thinking about the question. He's just distracted. Bloom isn't a systematic thinker, to put it mildly. He saw a rowboat rock at anchor on the treacly swells lazily its plastered board. Now there's an example of free and direct discourse. Notice how the narrator has, by sympathizing with Bloom's looking at the water, has lost his syntactic control of the sentence and given us a sentence which wanders off its subject. That's an example of free and direct discourse now. Of course, Bloom's lack of mental discipline is implied also in the syntax of that sentence. Keno's 11 shillings trousers. Now he's reading that placard on a boat, which the Kenos, the the gentleman's outfitters they've rented this boat, and it's in the middle of the river, and they have a tide on both sides so that the ads are on both sides of the boat. And Bloom notices it. And as an advertiser, he's always looking for opportunities or ideas about advertising things. And good idea that. Now, the good idea to Bloom is that this sales on gentlemen's pants is on. I wonder if he pays rent to the corporation. Bloom is a practical man, and he wonders, who owns the river. And of course, that raises very big questions about. Right, but you could easily go by that without noticing, and you should, at least in the second read of Ulysses, notice that several things. One, that Bloom has left his key behind him because he switched pants. He's wearing black pants because he's going to the funeral. And he left the key to his hall door in the pocket of the other pants. So now he's locked out of his own house. He has no key. Similarly, Stephen has left the Martello Tower. Mulligan has taken the key. So they're both, neither of them has a key to their homes. No keys, right? And they're both keyless citizens, therefore. And therefore, they're wandering around looking for another, right? And they're going to meet. The two keys are symbolically going to cross before the end of the day. They haven't yet met, but they're going to. And that's, of course, one of the big questions in the book. Will son meet father? Will Bloom find a son? Will Stephen find a father? Question. 11 shillings trousers. And of course, the 11 shillings is the sign for 11 shillings is made up of two parallel lines which don't meet. The 11th letter is K. And now we have an image of two parallel lines which never meet and two lines which cross, which, of course, the parallel lines which never meet means that there's no meaning in the universe. We're all traveling out forever into eternity. We'll never be redeemed from our wanderings. Whereas the covenant, the Old Testament, the Star of David, or the new one, the crossed keys, which we saw on today's news, symbolizes the papacy and the agreement between God and between Jesus and Peter to establish a new covenant, is the symbol of redemption in the Christian sense of the term. Bloom, by the way, same token, of course, is soliciting an ad for the Kilkenny company he's working for, and he's looking for the cross keys, which is a symbol of their business. So that cross keys thing works in several different ways now, you see. It has to do with metaphysics, it has to do with theology, it has to do with parallelism. And of course, again, the boat in the river, if you looked at it from above, the seagull can do that. Look down on it, you'll see that it itself is parallel to the two banks of the river, right? With the ropes holding it, crossing the river, holding it as an image of crossed rope. So that image is very richly woven into the text. Now, Bloom doesn't see it. He just sees the practical side of it. But the reader should, because the reader has been already given the information that can allow the reader to see this boat in the river representing a lot of different ideas. Materialism, parallelism, success. The trousers, of course, itself, too, has two parallel lines in it that meet in the generative place, and so on. I mean, you can. At which point do you stop? Well, Joyce sets it up so that you can So at the end of the novel, I'm not joking, because at the end of the novel I partly am. But Bloom and Stephen do stand in Bloom's backyard, urinating in parallel with one another against the wall, so that the two keys are exposed in parallel with one another, looking off into the stars, into the night stars. And so it's. I'm not sort of just being funny here. I'm saying that I am, but it's also the way in which Joyce makes sense out of the world. He sets you up in all kinds of little ways like this, which when you read the novel over and over, you have to read it many times before you read it, then you begin to see how it all works. Okay, let me quickly finish up here. How can you own water flowing like a stream? Now, this is, of course, what Stephen has been thinking about earlier on the beach. The parallel between the Protean beach and the flowing river are obvious. And It flowing in a stream never the same, which is the stream of life we trace. That's a quotation that Bloom has picked up. Because life is a stream. That's a little bit of a cliche, right? All kinds of places are good for ads. He doesn't. Bloom is not a poet in the way in which Stephen is. At least he's sort of a minor poet. Any advertising man has to be. He has to have some funny ideas that will grab people's attention. He is on a sort of mercantile level. Joyce says somewhere, language is used in two ways: the language of the marketplace, or the language as authorized by the literary tradition. The language of the marketplace, Bloom, or the language of the literary tradition, Stephen, right? And both languages are operating here, in beautiful consonance with one another. There are differences and there are similarities. Joyce is not, let me say, having said that, Stephen says that in Portrait of the Artist, but Joyce has more respect for ordinary people and ordinary language than that. Joyce doesn't look down on vulgar songs. Joyce loves music hall songs. He thought those were the poetry of the working class, and he respected that. They weren't Verdi or Wagner. Joyce loved Wagner more than anyone, and he had Wagner's operas complete, all annotated. He paid close attention to serious artists of his caliber, but he wasn't. He still respected the art of the poor, the art of the illiterate, because he recognized that they had the same conflicts as everyone else. So Joyce is a profound Democrat in that sense, although he's really very, very smart and very difficult in his life. He didn't tolerate fools at all. He didn't insult people, but he would cut somebody off if he thought they weren't able to keep up with them. That's true. And he was chauvinistic, yes, and he was intolerant, yes. But of major questions, he didn't discuss religion or politics at all with anyone. He kept it all for his books. But he was also very democratic in the sense that he recognized that everybody is human and everybody has the dignity of their suffering and of their loves, and that they had their own way of putting it. And some people put it in a more sophisticated way than others, but they're all equally dignified human beings. He's a profound Democrat in that way. So this novel is about that, among other things. So Bloom's sort of knockabout street-wiseness is one thing, and Stephen's bookishness is another. And they're both respected in different ways. And you see that here. You see Bloom's resilience. Bloom, of course, is worried about public health. He's worried about VD. He worries that he might get it from Molly now, because if Molly had sex with Mulligan, and Mulligan has VD, which he might, there was a serious worry at the time. They didn't have cures for it. And Joyce himself might have had it. We think he did. It was a worry all the time for people who'd had free sex when they were younger. So that comes up all the time, and Bloom worries about, although Bloom himself is not profligate. Bloom is worried a little bit about that. So that shows up here, but he also humorously thinks about it in respect to ads on men's urinals, and where you see men interfere with one another's graffiti. So the novel is full of all kinds of language, from graffiti to vulgar ads to the highest level of intellectual discourse. And that's one of the things that makes it such a wonderful book. It's not chaotic. It's not cynical. It's not a leg pull. It's a deadly serious work, but it's the funniest book in the world. I've read it 100 times, and some parts of it I've memorized because I've taught it so many times. And I have those a recording of the Irish, and I've listened to that 20, 30 times, and I get my students to begin that way with reading Ulysses. But what I've been saying here today is sort of a summary of a lot of stuff people will be talking about. And of course, there's 100 books written about it, and it's all highly debated in the Joyce journals. There's 3 Joyce journals full-time dealing with his work, and books coming out every week or 2 on him, because he's such an encyclopedic writer. And he, so we have an infinite, what I'll end up by saying, another thing about him that's, that he promised us. He said that he's put as many puzzles in this book as will keep the professors busy for centuries. And it is true that there are puzzles of all kinds in it, little ones, like the one I just mentioned with the Kino's 11 shillings trousers. That's a little puzzle, and I've answered it here. I'll just give you an example. But there are hundreds like that in the book. It also does something that nobody else has done. It also is significant in what it leaves out. As long as the book is, two very significant scenes that in any pot-boiling novelist would put in there aren't there. The conversation between Bloom and Molly before he leaves in the morning is left out. And the conversation between them after he returns that night is left out. And several other scenes are also. Joyce resists them, leaves them up to us to fill them in. He does this in some of the earlier stories too. He leaves out the easy parts, the easy things to write, the melodramatic scenes, and you fill it in yourself. He says, I've just written a book on Before Daybreak where I argue that the central figure in the story isn't in it at all. It's done by camouflage. God, if he exists, is here through his absence. Because we don't see him, it means he's here. The most significant things in life we don't see, put it another way. So Joyce leaves out that which is fundamental to the whole system. That's an important point in Joyce. He has that from the beginning of his work, that the final mystery of why we exist is unknown to us. And we can fill in that gap with God, or we can take the view that it's unknowable. We can take the agnostic view. Now, Joyce himself, his work is poised on that knife edge, and you can decide for yourself whether you think the empty spaces, there's nothing there, or that there is something there, and you fill it in yourself. So that's why I think that Joyce is a seriously religious writer. He's raising the fundamental questions that religious writers have from the beginning of time raised, and he puts it in modern terms, and you can decide whether to believe or not to believe, but you're going to have to do it by yourself. And Ulysses can be a stimulus to that, or it can encourage you to remain potentially a deep skeptic like Bloom. I will end, the last thing I'll say then is this, that Bloom is not, many people think this, and I think they're dead wrong, Bloom is not Joyce's answer to the question. Bloom is part of the dialogism between Bloom and Stephen. The key question is the spirit of the novel. What's that? The concealed narrator. The overall spirit of the book is something other than Stephen, Bloom, or Molly. That arranger or organizer of the thing is the equivalent to God. So you can't simply quote Bloom any more than you quote Polonius and say that's Shakespeare. A lot of people do it. Even professors do it, because it's an easy solution to a complex problem. You have to make judgments, as we do in life, between what the prophet said and whether you believe him or not, whether you find them credible or not. And this is a modern one. And I'd leave it at that. I think it's, because it's a great, great book, and it brings us in contact with all the fundamental questions that we serious people worry about. But Joyce has put them in a way that nobody has matched. Thank you. If you want to ask questions or are willing to stay, I'm happy to do it.
I've been carrying around this image in my mind as you've been speaking about Joyce as this sort of great architect. And I wonder if among his papers, did he leave any kind of sort of formal designs or architecture-like expositions of how this book is organized and laid out?
He did, yeah. He did. The Linati schema, which I think your husband passed around.
Yeah, I'm passing it around now.
Yeah. This schema, yes, he...
Okay. 18 episodes.
Yes, he did. He did. He had several. He had a schema an outline. He didn't follow it though. I mean, he only used it it's not vastly useful because he departed from it once he got going, like so many. He also had a map of Dublin. And he moved pins around on it. He had thumbtacks moving on where all the characters were. And he knew exactly where every character was at all times, that kind of thing. He even measured the speed of the river. He knew the speed of the river and the speed at which clouds blew through the sky so that clouds would pass over particular characters at different times. And he had it all worked out. One chapter in particular, he had a schema for every minute of the hour, where every character was, and where they would be on the street, whether they'd meet one another, and whether a seagull flying over A could be seen by C half a block away, that kind of thing. He'd done that, you know. Yes, he had schemas. Yes, we have some of his drafts of some of this stuff, but not a lot of it is gone. But we have some of the schemas. Yeah, sir.
I hate to be the one to say the emperor has no clothes here, but I have to ask the question. You know, sometimes I'm reading this and just thinking, you know, he's up there laughing at all of us.
Yes.
In other words, there's so much pretension, there's so many puzzles, there's so many references that it loses the ability to be the moving novel it could be. That it's too academic.
Yes.
And so I wonder what you would say to that. I mean, yeah, sure, it's a lot of fun, and I have the annotation, and I'm reading it, and it's like reading Sanskrit, you know, I've got 10,000 dictionaries, but am I really reading a novel? I feel like sometimes it's more of a crossword puzzle.
Yeah. Many people have taken the view that it is a giant leg pull, and that it's a huge joke, and that it's just his brilliance and fundamental skepticism and despair are thrown into this, and that's what T.S. Eliot said something like. Though T.S. Eliot had more positive things than that to say, he felt that it was the best portrait of the futility of modern life, where the mind of the modern, Joyce says it himself in another way, that the modern mind is able to contain so much information that it can't possibly make sense of it all, and that all we are reduced to doing is futile pursuit of immediacies, like paying our bills and enjoying a glass of wine in the evenings, but that there's no coherence to it all. I take the other view, but I agree. A lot of people feel that particularly in the later chapters, that he loses, he challenges the pedant and the academic. He brings out that more and more. A lot of people feel that. And some serious critics whose judgments are far superior to mine think that Portrait of the Artist is his great work, and that this is not. This has gone over the top. And Finnegan's Wake even further. Because Finnegan, if you think this is a problem, Finnegan's Wake is this cubed, you know, where language has taken over altogether, and however, that's where most of the work being done in Joyce today is. Of course, these are people who are making their living out of academic work, so that isn't necessarily trustworthy, right? Because they're getting paid for it. So I mean, you guys are reading it for the love of it, and for the value that it might have personally to you, and there's nobody paying you or anything for it. And I've great admiration for you doing that. I mean, but it is exercising your sense of humor and your mind. But whether it'll replace worship or prayer or fishing, I don't know. That's up to you.
Or Dickens.
Or Dickens, yes. It's not a novel in that sense. Yeah, it's parodying Dickens and so many others, of course. You recognize that. It's taking the mickey out of, as we say, out of people who expect conventional satisfaction from novels. Yes, it's not a novel in that sense. That's true. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm in a bit of shock because I'm realizing that my first time I read it was over half a century ago, which is closer to when he wrote it than it is to today. But
Yes.
you know, what your remark about the 21st century and Joyce, I was wondering, and you probably heard this too, that everyone's heard this, the fact that he's so intertextual, that he's almost a perfect writer for the internet and for this new world, in that sense that he's a bit of a prophet of the
You could
ways
say
of,
that.
you know,
Right.
and that there are parts, at least, of the illustrator which welcome him or,
Yes.
or there's a renewed interest because of that.
Yes, there's a factitious side to that and a substantive one. That is, that a lot of the citations that Joyce is making, and there's myriad of them, he has read the books in question, but he's read all of Dickens, for example. So anytime he quotes Dickens, he knows what he's talking about. He's read Bleak House and he's read Copperfield and so on. But a lot of others he hasn't. Particularly when he gets to the Wake, he gets people to read books for him and report, so that he can be encyclopedic, way beyond his own actual reading experience. We have plenty of evidence of that. He would raid lists of books and pull out. He'd go through a gazetteer of Australia and pull out all the river names and plonk them all into the thing. He did force the thing that way. That's true in the Wake now, not here. This was all done from memory, and he checked a lot of it over, and he got assistance with it. He correspondence. We have some of his letters where he had people look up things for him, where he couldn't remember exactly. But he had an astonishing memory, and he himself claimed. It's a point that's worth making, I think, that he had an astonishing memory. Everybody, of course, would agree on that. But he didn't think he had imagination in the way in which Blake or Yeats or Shelley does. It's all built up out of Aristotelian bits and pieces. It's not a flash of inspiration like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. He doesn't have that, and he knows he doesn't. But he's built it up out of sheer experience of life and literature, not out of flashes of inspiration.
Does he admit that himself, or is that
He does, yeah.
something people...
He admits that Yeats has imagination, that he doesn't. He did, yeah. He can be generous. He was very stinging in his credit of other people. He said of Hemingway, the highest praise he gave of anyone, was of that little story, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. I'm sure you know it. He said, I couldn't have written that, which is as generous as Joyce would be with anyone. He never praised Yeats, but he recited him, which indicated he did. He was very careful not to, he was very jealous and competitive. Synge he had a lot of respect for, and he was a great rival of it. He was afraid that Synge was going to have a greater reputation than he. And Synge, of course, died very young and didn't complete his creative life. Joyce felt threatened by him a bit, with good reason. Others he was competing with, George Moore, particularly when he was young. He realized he had superior gifts to Moore. He didn't worry about him, but he worried. He felt threatened by Proust, and he felt threatened by Kafka, because he felt that some people told him that Kafka was the new thing, the 30s, and he kept away from. He didn't even read him, but he felt that Kafka. People were feeling that Kafka was the next wave, and he was finished. So he was. He had good reason to be self-confident, but he also respected the difference that other writers had from his. He did meet Proust once, but they only said yes and no to one another. That's all. They conversed about nothing. They both felt threatened. Sir, you had a question?
Yes. This book was notorious before it was famous, and of course he couldn't have been naive about the sexual frankness, particularly that comes up toward the end with Molly Bloom.
Yes.
I think that people would have been more offended if they had really grasped the connection he was making between her sexual frankness and the way that it merges with our largest understanding, the mystical understanding of the universe, or at least in my interpretation of the book. So I'm trying to put that together,
Yes.
or with your very effective reading of Dante, and the sense of morality from Dante.
Yes.
Isn't the basic rule for Dante that it's what could be spoken in Beatrice's presence was what was moral? And I'm just thinking about his putting female sexuality together in such a graphic way that we got this book banned first. We can talk further about that.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have to go down that road, but I'm putting together that radical connection between sexual frankness and this cosmic vision of the world, and the fact that the book is moral and immoral at the same time.
Well, the people who criticized it or censored the book, the gentleman makes the point that the book was banned in America. However, it wasn't because of Molly. It was because of a previous chapter which appeared in a journal called The Little Review in New York in 1919. It was the chapter, it was the Nausicaa chapter. Somebody was reading Nausicaa. That's the one that got him into trouble, where Bloom masturbates. That was banned expressly, and that caused the book to be. Now, it was banned, though, partially for the reasons you cite, of course, but the people who banned it had no idea of what you're speaking. They were just banned by its sexual frankness. And from Joyce's point of view, it was not pornographic. And of course, eventually it was liberated here in 1932, 4. It was judged not to be pornographic, that the descriptions of sexuality in it were not an incitement to sexual activity, but a humorous and in some respects pathetic representation of it, right? Bloom's, for example. But Joyce felt that life should be depicted objectively and humanely, and he also made an important distinction, which a lot of people don't recognize, which is very important to Joyce and to me most of the time. The word fuck appears in this, but Joyce never said it in his own life at all. He might have he never did in anybody's presence that anybody reports. He was very careful. He was very gentlemanly in all of his conversation. He would leave the room if somebody said something blasphemous, for example, or said something salacious, or said something sexually offensive. He was out of there. He was very much of a gentleman with respect to his social behavior. However, there's a big difference between that and what one can do in private and in the privacy of one's own study by reading this book. So Joyce has a firm line there between the private and the public, which I think is an important one from a point of view of social sanity and social morality. So the people, therefore, who banned the book or moved to have it banned weren't interested or able to make the connection you're making, which is a sophisticated one. They were simply saying we can't have 4-letter words in print available on the public market until the Judge Woolsey came along and said it's the context that's important, and that therefore it's not an issue. So the book was banned in the United States. It was never banned in Ireland, and partially because it never reached the notice of the censors. So the book was smuggled in here. The early printings of it were smuggled into the United States. So it was 12 years in print before it got into the United States. In the meantime, pirated editions of it were on sale here, and Joyce couldn't get anything for them. There was a problem with that. But it is a benchmark book in that respect, in the opening up of the field of literature, the subject to previously taboo topics. But Joyce felt, of course, quite as we would all accept today, that sexuality and violence and alcoholism and defecation are all part of life and they're all part of our daily experience, and we have to make sense of them in some way. And he's trying to do that. In his early work, he identifies with François Villon, the French poet, who saw himself as a scatological critic of stuffed shirts, particularly ecclesiastical ones, stuffed chasubles maybe. And Joyce sees himself somewhat similar. Having said that, I will also say that for Joyce, the model of the artist is the priest. Joyce thought about becoming a Jesuit himself, as you probably know, and he was invited to and declined. But he always held the idea of what the priest does in the sacrament to be the sort of mysterious equivalent. Joyce's work is the aesthetic equivalent of that mystery, of the conversion of bread into a mystical body. And Joyce takes that idea very seriously as the highest expression in human culture of mystery. And he sees his work as an emulation of that. Because he sees that, and he sees the idea of grace, the Christian idea. He's called James Augustine Joyce, and he takes his name seriously. He read Augustine's Confessions and took Augustine's great contribution to Western theology is the idea of grace, not the idea of original sin, both. But grace, he's the doctrine of grace. And Joyce takes the idea of grace very seriously. People don't seem to understand that. And he sees his work as being a work of extraordinary, equivalent of grace, a divinely empowered book. Yeah. Long answer to a question, but. All right. Thank you. You've been a great audience.